Based on the skeletal evidence in Volume 2, we concluded that biblical Jews of the time of Christ were 50 to 75% black. The genetic evidence in Volume 3 backs this up. It was at this time that ancient Judeans were forced to leave Palestine and live in the diaspora. See the attached PDF, Figure 2. Such a level of blackness in a population would be noticed by writers of the period. Where Jews are mentioned in the classical world, do we find references to this blackness? Tacitus. Publius Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman senator and historian who lived from 56 to 117 A.D. His two main works were the Annals and Histories. In the latter, he gave an account of Emperor Titus's war against the Jews and the destruction of Jerusalem. As a prelude to the war report, he began by giving traditions concerning the origins of the Jews. The Cretan Theory. These traditions all tell a story about the physical appearance of Jews at the time of Tacitus, even if not directly stated. We shall look at his account line by line. He begins with the following words. The Jews are said to have been refugees from the island of Crete, who settled in the remotest corner of Libya in the days when, according to the story, Saturn was driven from his throne by the aggression of Jupiter. This is a deduction from the name Iudai, by which they became known. The word is to be regarded as a barbarous lengthening of Idai, the name of the people dwelling around the famous Mount Ida in Crete. Most authorities, however, agree on the following account. This theory seems bizarre at first, but the present author recognizes the events being described. The allegation is that, in remote times, there was a natural disaster in or around Crete which led to refugees settling in North Africa, around the area of today's Libya. This disaster was associated with astronomical events involving Saturn and Jupiter. In ancient times, disasters were often linked to astronomical events. Such a disaster actually took place when a tremendous earthquake struck Asia Minor, unleashing a massive refugee crisis. Armies of refugees attacked all the nations of the eastern Mediterranean, giving rise to new populations like the Philistines in Israel. In the Bible, the Philistines are said to come from Crete. See Jeremiah chapter 47, verse 4. Other refugees were settled in North Africa and spread westwards, that is, the remotest corner of Libya. Why were the Jews linked to this event? There are three possible reasons for this. First, the Cretan refugees settled in both North Africa and Israel. That alone could make people confuse them for Jews. Tacitus himself provides the logic behind the second possible reason. He implies the people who lived around Mount Ida in Crete were known as Idai, and that this was the origin of Iudai, the Hebrew pronunciation for Judean. Similarity of names has often led ancient scholars to theorize connections between peoples for whom there were no other connecting evidence. 19th century scholars followed the same pattern. The third reason concerns information given by the Jewish historian Josephus in his book Antiquities of the Jews. It was written in the 1st century A.D. Josephus told us Cush, the eldest son of Ham, had 4 sons, of whom Regmus was the last. Regmus had a son called Eudotus, who was the ancestor of the Eudodeans. He called them a nation of western Ethiopians. The region of western Ethiopia stretched from Sudan, covering the northern Sahara, up to the Atlantic. It would appear the Eudodeans were located near the Gaetuli, an ancient people of the Algerian northern Sahara. According to Josephus, the Gaetuli were the descendants of Havilah, the second son of Cush. This would agree with the idea that they settled in the remotest corner of Libya. It should be clear why the name Eudotus would be confused with Judah or Judas, that is, Judah or Judas. When all three reasons are understood, the tradition recited by Tacitus makes sense. It is not a factual account of the origins of the Jews, but it does tell us that Jews of the 1st century were thought by some to originate on Crete. This should cause us to ask, what did Cretans look like? In figures 3 through 5 of the attached PDF, we have shown New Kingdom Egyptian youth next to an image of Cretans from the Minoan period to compare complexions. From the images of Cretans, we can see that some had an Egyptian complexion, as seen in figures 3 and 5, and others had a European complexion, as seen in figure 4. This suggests that some Jews of the 1st century AD resembled both Egyptian-complexioned and pale-complexioned Cretans. At this point in our reasoning, we do not have enough information to conclude whether dark or pale complexions were in the majority. The Egypto-Ethiopian theory. Tacitus continues with his account by presenting other theories about Jewish origins. A few authorities hold that in the reign of Isis, the surplus population of Egypt was evacuated to neighboring lands under the leadership of Hierosolumus and Judas. Many assure us that the Jews were descended from those Ethiopians who were driven by fear and hatred to emigrate from their home country when Cepheus was king. First, we notice that a few authorities thought Jews were descended from surplus Egyptians from the time of Isis. Second, we notice that many, presumably many authorities, hold Jews to be descended from Ethiopians from the time of Cepheus. Egypt in the 1st century AD was a country of African and European complexioned people, but it was the former who were primarily associated with the nation. Ethiopia, or Northern Sudan as it is known today, was a country of only African complexions at this time. On this basis, we conclude it is the African complexioned people who were being identified as the ancestors of the Judeans. Mesopotamian and Selimian theory. Tacitus continues with his account of Jewish origin traditions. There are some who say that a motley collection of landless Assyrians occupied a part of Egypt, and then built cities of their own, inhabiting the lands of the Hebrews and the nearest parts of Syria. Others, again, find a famous ancestry for the Jews in the Solymi, who are mentioned with respect in the epics of Homer. This tribe is supposed to have founded Jerusalem and named it after themselves. This tradition preserves a memory of the Hyksos rulers of Egypt, who came out of the Levant, that is, Syro-Palestine. They seized control of Egypt at the end of the Middle Kingdom. It also seems to preserve a memory of Abraham and his retinue coming from Ur of the Chaldees in Mesopotamia. The name Assyria in the classical period referred to Mesopotamia as a whole. Traditions often combine two or more events into one account. The people of Mesopotamia had obvious African appearance, as discussed in the book Black Sumer, Volume 2, by Hermel Hermstein. Assyrian ancestors are, therefore, not a pale alternative to the dark ancestors so far discussed. Tacitus also informs us that some authorities think the Solymi were ancestors of the Jews and built Jerusalem. This is what is said about the Solymi by Josephus. At the last, there passed over a people wonderful to behold, for they spoke a Phoenician tongue with their mouths. They dwelt in the Solymian mountains near a broad lake. Their heads were sooty. They had round razors or shaven heads on them. Their heads and faces were like nasty horse heads also, that had been hardened in smoke. Josephus thought this description related to the Jews. Phoenician and Hebrew are both dialects of the same language. This would have contributed to Josephus linking the Solymi here with Jews. The term sooty, in reference to heads, indicates black color. Since they were shaven-headed, it is the skin that was sooty, rather than the hair. Josephus obviously saw no contradiction between being dark-colored and being a Judean. The last theory proposed by Tacitus he credits to the majority. Most authorities, however, agree on the following account. The whole of Egypt was once plagued by a wasting disease, which caused bodily disfigurement. So Pharaoh Baccharis went to the oracle of Hammon to ask for a cure, and was told to purify his kingdom by expelling the victims to other lands. They, the expelled victims, traveled on for 6 days without a break, and on the 7th, they expelled the previous inhabitants of Canaan, took over their lands, and in them built a holy city and temple. This, too, is a combination of elements from different historical periods. Pharaoh Baccharis ruled Lower Egypt when the Cushites ruled Upper Egypt in the late 8th century BC. This was long after the first mention of Israel on the stele of Pharaoh Mereneptah in the late 13th century BC. The exodus from Egypt must have happened before the date of this reference. What this report tells us of value is that, yet again, Egyptians are seen as the ancestors of the Judeans. Had Judeans looked radically different from Egyptians, the classical authorities would not have had this view. Conclusion. The ancestors of the Jews are seen as being the Egyptians, Mesopotamian invaders of Egypt, Ethiopians, Solomai, or Cretans. Whether these theories are correct is not the issue. The issue is what all these populations have in common, and what their suspected ancestor relationship to Judeans says about the appearance of the Judeans. What all of these populations have in common is the presence of African complexions amongst them. Some of these people only had African complexions. It seems impossible that this could be the case without black ancestry being associated with Judeans of the 1st century AD.